The sleepy suburban neighborhood, with its row of white picket fences and neatly manicured lawns, seemed like the perfect place for Heather to start over. After a difficult year filled with heartbreak and setbacks, moving to a new town was her chance to rebuild a sense of peace. She found solace in the quiet streets and fresh air, walking Max, her loyal service dog, each morning and evening. Max, a golden retriever, was more than just a companion. He was her lifeline, providing support and comfort she could never find in the world of humans. His warm eyes and gentle demeanor made him the ideal partner for navigating the challenges of everyday life. But peace, as Heather soon learned, was not guaranteed. From the moment she arrived, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. There was something unsettling about the neighborhood's calm, an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't long before she figured out who the source was: Karen, the HOA president, a woman with an air of entitlement that made the rest of the community cower in fear, seemed to always be lurking in the background, her eyes trained on Heather and Max like a hawk watching its prey. Karen's house stood at the end of the street, a pristine white colonial with perfectly trimmed hedges and an unnervingly well-maintained lawn. Every time Heather walked past, she could feel Karen's gaze burning into her, as though the woman was silently judging every step she took. The first time their eyes met, Heather tried to smile in greeting, but Karen's face remained as cold and stern as a marble statue. She didn't even flinch when Max, wagging his tail, gave her a friendly nudge. Instead, Karen's lips curled into a thin, disapproving line. Over the next few days, Heather noticed the same pattern. As soon as she stepped outside with Max, Karen was there, watching from her front porch or peering through the window, never breaking her vigil. Heather couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was looking for something. Something to criticize, something to control. At first, Heather dismissed the thought. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, she told herself. After all, people who run the HOA are supposed to be involved in the neighborhood's well-being, right? But it wasn't long before Karen's passive-aggressive behavior escalated. One afternoon, Heather returned from a walk with Max to find a letter slipped under her door. It was from the HOA, written in bold, formal language, warning her that Max might be disturbing the peace. The letter mentioned a vague complaint from a neighbor and demanded that she provide proof of Max's service dog certification within 48 hours. Heather's hands trembled as she read the letter. What was this? It seemed like an attack out of nowhere. She knew Max was her legal right to have, but the threat was unsettling. Could it really be Karen behind this? The thought made Heather's blood run cold. The woman who had stared her down with such icy contempt suddenly had the power to ruin everything. Suspense. As Heather read the letter again, she felt a growing sense of dread. This was no coincidence. Karen was behind it, no doubt. And this time, it wasn't just Heather's peace of mind that was at stake. Max was her rock, her stability in a world that had too often let her down. How far would Karen go to tear that apart? The neighborhood felt different now, darker, as if the shadow of Karen's watchful eyes had grown larger. Heather couldn't ignore the sense that she was trapped in a game, and she had no idea what the next move would be. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just about a complaint or a simple misunderstanding. Something was about to snap. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Heather couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the neighborhood were closing in around her. Each time she stepped outside with Max, her gaze flicked toward Karen's house, half expecting the woman to be lurking behind her curtains, watching. And sure enough, there Karen was, always there, always watching. Heather tried to keep her distance, focusing on Max as he guided her through their walks, but she could feel Karen's eyes burning into her from every corner. As if the letter wasn't enough, a few days later, Heather was greeted by an unexpected knock on her door. She opened it to find a neatly dressed man standing on her doorstep, a clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Kevin from the HOA," he said with a too-sweet smile, his eyes glancing nervously down at Max. "I'm just here to remind you of the neighborhood guidelines and make sure everything's in order." Heather's stomach twisted. The letter had been one thing, but this was a warning, a message that things were escalating, and it wasn't just a friendly reminder. Kevin's smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes darted to Max again before quickly looking away. The message was clear. Heather was being watched, and the HOA had begun to tighten its grip. "Everything's fine. Thank you," Heather replied, trying to keep her tone casual, though her hands shook slightly. "Max is a service dog. He's fully certified." Kevin nodded but didn't leave right away. "Just a reminder, Mom," he said, his voice becoming slightly more insistent. "The neighborhood expects everyone to adhere to the guidelines. We take pride in maintaining a certain image around here. If there are any issues, don't hesitate to reach out." And with that, he turned and walked off, leaving Heather standing in the doorway, feeling the weight of his unspoken message hanging in the air. The tension between Heather and the HOA continued to build, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. She didn't know who had complained, but the feeling of being under constant scrutiny was suffocating. The walls of her new home, which she had hoped would offer her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every move she made, every step she took with Max, seemed to be under an invisible microscope. It wasn't long before Heather's suspicions about Karen were confirmed. As she walked Max down the street one evening, she spotted Karen standing on her porch, hands on her hips, staring at them with a look of barely contained disdain. This time, Heather didn't look away. She met Karen's gaze head-on, trying to show that she wasn't intimidated, but it only seemed to make Karen's expression harder, more venomous. "Your dog's a nuisance," Karen called out in a loud voice, making sure every neighbor could hear. "You're disturbing the peace. You better watch out." Heather's blood ran cold. Was this a direct threat? She could feel the eyes of the neighbors on her, but she refused to back down. "He's a service dog," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "I'm within my rights." But Karen wasn't done. With a final sneer, she muttered, "You'll see. I'll make sure of that." As Heather walked away, her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of Karen's words hanging over her like a storm cloud, threatening to burst. There was no mistaking it now. Karen was out to get her, and she was using every tool at her disposal to do it. Suspense. Heather quickened her pace, trying to outrun the gnawing sense of dread that was creeping up on her. What was Karen planning? And how far would she go to get Heather out of the neighborhood? The tension was suffocating, and Heather knew deep down that something far more dangerous was coming. Max tugged at the leash, as if sensing her unease. He was always her anchor, but even he couldn't calm the growing storm within her. The following morning was still, too still. The heavy weight of Karen's threat seemed to hang over Heather's every move, and the usual calm she found in her walks with Max had vanished, replaced with a creeping sense of dread. As she stepped out the door, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the neighborhood, making it feel oddly unfamiliar. She adjusted Max's harness, trying to ignore the growing pit in her stomach. The air was crisp, and the sound of distant birdsong was the only thing breaking the silence, until she heard it. A door creaked open. Heather didn't need to look up to know who it was. Karen's house loomed in her peripheral vision, her silhouette framed by the door as she stood watching them. It was as if Karen had been waiting for this very moment. Heather didn't want to engage. She just wanted to get Max his morning walk and make it back to the safety of her home. But Karen wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't think you're above the rules just because you've got that dog with you." Karen's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and pointed. Heather's pulse quickened. She had been trying to keep a low profile, but Karen wasn't giving her that luxury. She swallowed hard, forcing a tight smile. "Max is a service dog. I'm within my rights," she said, her voice steady, though it was beginning to crack with anxiety. But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she took a step forward, eyes narrowing as she glanced at Max with undisguised disgust. "He's a problem," Karen muttered, almost to herself, but loud enough for Heather to hear. "You're a problem." A chill ran down Heather's spine. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was personal. And it was about to get worse. Before Heather could say anything else, Karen suddenly rushed forward, her hand darting behind her back as she pulled out a canister. It all happened so quickly that Heather didn't have time to react. A sharp hiss split the air as Karen aimed the nozzle at Max, and before Heather could even yell, a foul-smelling liquid sprayed across Max's coat. Max yelped in surprise, recoiling from the sting. Heather's heart skipped a beat as the horrible smell assaulted her senses. The liquid had an acrid, chemical odor, sharp and unmistakable. Max's fur was already matted with it, and his eyes widened in panic. His tail tucked, and he tried to back away from the source of the pain, his body trembling. "Max!" Heather shouted, rushing toward him. Her breath caught in her throat as she knelt to comfort him, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "What did you do?" she cried, her voice desperate. Karen just stood there, a cruel smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "He's nothing but a nuisance," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "You'll thank me later when he's gone." Heather's mind raced, the shock of the attack numbing her for a moment. Had she really just done that? The woman who had made Heather's life a living hell had just attacked her service dog in broad daylight. Her hands trembled as she tried to comfort Max, who was still shaking, his fur now clumped with the foul substance. She could feel the heat of her anger building, but she knew she had to stay calm. This was a crime, a dangerous one, and she needed to act fast. Max whimpered, looking up at her with those trusting eyes, and Heather's heart shattered. This was too far. Karen had gone too far. Suspense. Heather's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of fear and rage. What was that chemical? What had Karen just done to Max? She needed to get him help, fast. But how could she do that while Karen stood there, triumphant, as if she had won some kind of twisted victory? The feeling of helplessness gnawed at Heather as she watched Max struggle to regain his composure. And worse, she knew this was only the beginning. What would Karen do next? How far would this woman go to tear her life apart? But one thing was clear. Heather wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. No matter what it took, Heather would make sure she paid for this. The air seemed to thicken around Heather as she cradled Max in her arms, her heart racing with fear and anger. His body trembled, the toxic spray still clinging to his fur, and his eyes were wide with panic. She could feel the weight of Karen's cold gaze on them as she stood across the yard, still wearing that same smug, almost sadistic expression. "Don't just stand there. Help him," Heather screamed, her voice sharp and frantic. But Karen only watched, as if savoring Heather's desperation. Max whimpered softly, his golden fur matted and sticky with the chemical, and Heather's breath hitched. This wasn't just some petty act of cruelty. No, this was something more dangerous, something calculated. She felt a sickening chill crawl up her spine. What had Karen sprayed on him? It didn't look like anything that could be found in any normal household. "Call the cops," Heather shouted, her voice shaking as she cradled Max closer to her chest. The minutes stretched into eternity, each second heavier than the last, as she carefully checked Max for any immediate signs of harm. His skin was reddening where the liquid had touched, and his breathing had become shallow, almost labored. As she reached for her phone, her hands shaking violently, Karen finally spoke again, her voice casual, as if she hadn't just attacked a living being. "You should have listened, you know. This neighborhood is mine. You're just a visitor, and your dog, well, he's no exception." Heather's anger flared up in an instant. This was beyond bullying. This was deliberate harm. She called 911, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened, barely able to get the words out. The operator reassured her that help was on the way, but it felt like hours before the squad car finally pulled up to the curb. The officer, a young woman with sharp eyes, immediately knelt beside Heather and Max, scanning the scene with a practiced gaze. "What happened here?" she asked, but her tone was firm, businesslike, like she knew exactly what was going on. Heather's voice was still raw with emotion as she quickly explained, pointing toward Karen, who had yet to show any remorse. She sprayed Max with something. Some sort of chemical. I don't know what it is, but it's toxic. He's in pain, and I don't know how bad it is. The officer's eyes narrowed, then turned toward Karen, who now stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The officer didn't waste any time. "Ma'am," she called to Karen, her voice cold and authoritative. "I need to speak with you about what happened." Karen's face twisted in annoyance. "I didn't do anything wrong," she scoffed. "That dog's a menace to this community. He's been causing problems ever since she moved in." Heather's blood ran cold as she realized what Karen was insinuating. She'd been plotting this for longer than Heather had thought. The way Karen spoke, so casually, as if this was all part of some twisted plan to force Heather out. Heather's fists clenched, her mind racing with the sickening realization that this had gone from petty harassment to something much more dangerous. But it was the officer's next words that struck Heather like a bolt of lightning. "We're going to need to have a look at that chemical, Mom," the officer said, eyeing Karen sharply. "Because if this turns out to be what I think it is, you're in serious trouble." A cold rush of panic swept over Heather as the officer reached for the canister that Karen had carelessly left on her porch. The label, though faint from use, became clearer with a closer look. Heather's stomach lurched. The spray Karen had used wasn't just some random pesticide. It was a powerful industrial-grade pest control chemical, one that was highly toxic to both animals and humans. Heather's heart skipped a beat as the officer read the label aloud, confirming her worst fears. "This is illegal, and you're going to need to come with us." Karen's face drained of color, her earlier arrogance fading into something more desperate. She took a step back, her hands raised in protest. "This is ridiculous. You can't." Before she could finish her sentence, the officer's partner moved in, grabbing Karen by the arm. "You're under arrest for animal cruelty and assault. You'll be booked and questioned about this incident." Suspense. Heather's pulse thundered in her ears. The officer was right. The chemical was as dangerous as it was illegal. Karen had just committed a crime. But it wasn't just any crime. She had done it deliberately, with the knowledge that the spray could cause harm. This wasn't just a moment of frustration. This was a calculated attack. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Karen's eyes locked onto Heather's, and for the first time, there was no smugness, no arrogance, just a cold fury. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But Heather didn't flinch. No, she didn't regret a thing. Because today, the tables had turned, and Karen was going to pay for what she had done. The handcuffs clicked shut with an icy finality as Karen was escorted to the squad car, her once imposing presence now reduced to something almost pitiable. The smugness that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a desperate, venomous glare aimed squarely at Heather. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Karen hissed, her voice rising with a frantic edge. "I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood. No one will believe you. You'll regret this. Mark my words." Heather didn't flinch. She stood firm, watching as the officer guided Karen into the back of the squad car. Her hands still trembled, but there was a sense of victory swelling inside her. Max was still trembling beside her, but with the officers now taking control of the situation, she felt a small measure of relief. The officer, a woman named Officer Green, turned back toward Heather, her expression serious. "We'll take care of this, but you need to get Max to a vet as soon as possible. The chemical she used could cause more damage than you realize, especially if it's not washed off quickly." Heather nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I will. Thank you." As the squad car drove off, Heather stood frozen in place for a moment longer, the weight of the situation sinking in. She'd taken a huge step, but the war wasn't over. Karen had made it clear that she wouldn't go down easily. The threats, the nasty words, they were just the beginning. Heather could feel the tension creeping back into the neighborhood, an unspoken energy that warned of an impending storm. She glanced at Max, who had finally stopped trembling, but his body was still tense, his golden fur clumped with the toxic residue. She needed to get him to safety, to the vet, but she also knew that she had to stay sharp. The battle had just begun. The drive to the vet was a blur of worried thoughts. Heather's mind raced as she held Max gently in her lap, speaking soothingly to him as he lay there, exhausted from the ordeal. The minutes stretched, her mind replaying Karen's every word, every sneer. What was she talking about? Heather wondered. Who was she trying to warn me about? The vet confirmed what Heather had feared. Max had suffered mild chemical burns, and the residue would need to be flushed out immediately. The vet's tone was professional, but there was an underlying concern in his eyes as he cleaned Max's fur and gave him a series of injections to counteract any potential poisoning. "You're lucky you got here in time," the vet said, his voice calm but tinged with caution. "We'll monitor him for the next 24 hours, but he'll be okay." But Heather wasn't sure she felt lucky. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the first chapter of a much darker story. Karen hadn't just attacked her service dog. She had done it in a way that could have been far worse. And she had threatened Heather's entire future in the neighborhood. Back home, Heather couldn't relax. The silence of her empty house was suffocating, and Max, now resting on his bed, was still a little out of sorts. Though the worst seemed to be over. She glanced at the window, her thoughts darting to Karen. Was she still out there, behind the closed curtains, plotting her next move? Heather knew she had to prepare. Karen wouldn't just slink away, not after the way things had gone down. Heather had seen the cold fury in her eyes, the way Karen's mind was already working on her next scheme. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was tighter than Heather had realized, and if Karen had allies, the battle would be far from over. Heather was no longer just an outsider. She was a target, and she knew that Karen wouldn't rest until she had her removed. Suspense. The thought of what might come next sent a chill through Heather's spine. What would Karen do to retaliate? What had she meant by her cryptic words before being arrested? The threat was clear. Heather was no longer safe. And the wheels of the HOA machine were turning, whether Heather was ready for it or not. The storm had only just begun. Max's soft snoring broke the silence in the room, but Heather didn't feel any comfort in the sound. Instead, she was steeling herself for whatever Karen had planned. She had made it through today, but Heather knew the worst was yet to come, and she had to be ready. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and vigilance. Heather found herself glancing over her shoulder every time she stepped outside, feeling the oppressive weight of Karen's wrath, even though the woman was behind bars. But Karen's threats weren't just empty words. No, they were a declaration of war. Heather had thought she'd won. She had stood up to the bully, taken her down when no one else would. But now, the ramifications were beginning to sink in. It wasn't just Karen who was angry. Heather was becoming a target in a much larger game. It started with small things. Nothing overt, nothing that would be immediately obvious to an outsider. But to Heather, they were glaring signs that the fight was far from over. Her mailbox was vandalized, its contents shredded and scattered across her lawn. The garden hose had been cut in several places. Her fence gate, which had always been sturdy, was suddenly hanging loose on one side. Each new act of sabotage felt like a silent threat, a message from the unseen forces that Karen had rallied behind her. By the fourth day, Heather's paranoia had reached a breaking point. Every time she left her home, her steps felt like they were under surveillance. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It was everyone who had been silently complicit, too scared to speak up or act against Karen. But then, things took a turn. One evening, after a long day of dealing with Max's recovery, Heather came home to find something strange in her driveway. A thick envelope, sealed and addressed to her in bold block letters. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully opened it, the cold rush of dread creeping up her spine. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, and on it, a typed message that made her blood run cold. "You haven't won yet. Your next mistake will cost you everything. Keep your head down, or you'll be sorry." The letter was unsigned. No return address, just a chilling warning. Heather's hands shook as she read the words over and over, her mind racing with the possibilities. Who could have sent this? Who was behind it? And more importantly, what was the next mistake she had to avoid? She couldn't breathe. Every instinct told her to call the police, but she already knew this wasn't just an isolated event. The HOA's grip was tightening around her. The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a promise that something bigger was brewing behind the scenes. As Heather sat on her couch, staring at the letter in her hands, the weight of what she was facing began to sink in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future of her life in this neighborhood. The game was far from over, and Karen was only the tip of the iceberg. If this was the level of hostility she was facing, what else could the HOA do to her? Suspense. Max whimpered softly from the other room, his gentle reminder of the innocence she was fighting to protect. Heather's mind raced with possibilities. What if the HOA was working with Karen's allies to drive her out? What if she wasn't just dealing with a group of angry neighbors, but a well-organized campaign designed to destroy her? She couldn't stay silent anymore. This was war. Silent, invisible, and all-encompassing. And Heather was ready to fight back with everything she had. The real battle had just begun, and she was about to expose the underbelly of a system far darker than she had ever imagined. But she had to be smart. One wrong move, and it could all be over. The days that followed the letter were a blur of tension. Heather could feel the threat closing in like a tightening noose, suffocating every part of her daily life. The once peaceful neighborhood now seemed like a hostile territory, each street and sidewalk fraught with danger. The worst part was the eerie silence. Her neighbors, once friendly or at least cordial, now avoided eye contact when she passed. No one seemed to care about her struggle, or perhaps they were too afraid to intervene. The truth was, Heather was alone. Max, still recovering from the attack, had become her anchor in the storm, his gentle presence a reminder that despite everything, there was something worth fighting for. But as the days wore on, even he seemed to sense the unease in the air. His usually playful nature had dulled, and he stuck close to Heather, his watchful eyes scanning their surroundings with a wariness that mirrored her own. It wasn't until the 7th day after the letter arrived that the situation escalated. Heather was taking Max for his evening walk, the cool night air doing little to ease the tension that had built up in her chest. The street was empty, the quiet oppressive, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed seemed to slow as it neared her, and every person who walked by seemed to linger too long, eyes lingering on her before quickly looking away. As they turned the corner onto their usual route, Heather stopped dead in her tracks. There, just ahead, stood Karen. The woman was back, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, her expression twisted into something between fury and smug satisfaction. She was alone, but there was a menacing energy surrounding her, an aura of malice that made Heather's skin crawl. Max growled softly, sensing the danger long before Heather could process what was happening. She immediately stepped in front of him, instinctively shielding her dog from the woman's proximity. "What do you want?" Heather demanded, her voice shaking but determined. Karen didn't speak at first. Instead, she just stood there, a twisted smile playing at the corners of her lips. The air between them crackled with an almost palpable tension. "I warned you," Karen said, her voice cold and filled with venom. "You think you've won, but you've only just begun to feel the consequences of your little rebellion." Heather's heart pounded in her chest. "What are you talking about?" Karen's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You really don't get it, do you? You've made a mistake by standing up to me. This neighborhood is mine, and you are nothing but an inconvenience. People like you don't belong here, and I've made sure of it." Before Heather could respond, Karen took a deliberate step forward, and that's when she saw it, a faint glint in Karen's hand. A small silver object, a knife. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had anticipated Karen's cruel words, maybe more vandalism or threats, but this was different. This was real danger. Karen wasn't just a bully anymore. She was a predator. Max's growl grew louder, more forceful. He stood rigid, ready to defend Heather with every ounce of his being. Heather's hands shook as she placed herself between Karen and her dog. She had no idea what to do next. She couldn't run. She couldn't let Karen harm Max. "Stay back," Heather commanded, her voice sharp. "If you think for 1 second that I'm scared of you, you're wrong." Karen took another step forward, her eyes narrowing. "You should be," she spat, her grip on the knife tightening. "You're about to learn exactly how much power I have." Suspense. Heather's pulse thundered in her ears. What was Karen going to do? The cold glint of the knife in the dim light made everything feel too real, too dangerous. Heather knew she had to act fast. One wrong move, and this could end in disaster. Max's growl deepened into a fierce bark, his body trembling with the instinct to protect. Heather didn't dare look away from Karen. Her mind raced with options, each one more risky than the last. Would the police arrive in time? Could she fend Karen off alone? But as Karen took another step forward, something unexpected happened. A car screeched to a halt just behind them. Heather whipped around to see a figure jump out, a man in a suit, tall and imposing, his face stern with authority. The last thing Heather expected was for someone to intervene, but there he was, standing between her and Karen. "Step away from her," the man commanded in a low, firm voice. Karen froze. The knife in her hand dropped with a sharp clatter to the ground. The sudden shift in power left Heather momentarily stunned. Who was this person? What had just happened? The man didn't waste any time. He moved quickly, grabbing Karen's arm and twisting it behind her back in one swift motion, expertly restraining her. "Twist. You're under arrest," the man said, his voice calm but final. "For the assault on Heather and for your actions tonight." As Karen was led away, stunned into silence, Heather stood there, still processing the bizarre turn of events. Her heart raced, but the danger had passed. For now. But the real question echoed in her mind. Who was this man? And why had he come just when things seemed like they were about to spiral out of control? The shock from the unexpected intervention took a moment to wear off. But as the man secured Karen into the back of another squad car, Heather was left standing, her mind racing in 100 directions. Who was this mysterious figure? She couldn't fathom why or how he'd come to her aid, but there was no denying that he had been in the right place at the right time. The officer, Officer Green, who had been by Heather's side during the earlier chaos, approached her with a look of cautious relief. She gestured toward the man, who was now speaking to another officer, his stance exuding authority. "He's with us," Officer Green explained. "You're safe now, but I'll need you to come with me to the station. We'll finalize the details of everything that's happened." Heather's mind was spinning. Her heart was still pounding from the encounter with Karen. And now this new person, someone who seemed to have come out of nowhere, was complicating the situation even further. Was he just a random bystander? Or had he been watching the situation unfold, waiting for the right moment to act? "I don't understand," Heather murmured, glancing at Officer Green. "Who is he? Why was he here?" The officer hesitated before answering, her gaze shifting between Heather and the man. "He's part of a private security team. He's been watching Karen for a while now." The words hit Heather like a cold gust of wind. Private security. Watching Karen. What did that mean? Why hadn't anyone told her about this? Before she could ask more questions, the man approached, his expression unreadable, his sharp features framed by the dimming streetlights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that screamed professional, but there was something else about him. A quiet intensity that made Heather feel both relieved and uneasy. "Heather, I assume," he said smoothly, his voice deep but gentle. She nodded, still too rattled to speak. "My name's David Caldwell," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been following the situation with Karen for a while. You've been caught up in something much bigger than you realize, something that involves not just her, but a lot of people you don't want to mess with." Heather's stomach dropped. A bigger situation. What did that even mean? David took a step closer, his tone lowering. "I wasn't expecting Karen to escalate things so quickly. But now that she has, things are about to get a lot messier." Her head spun. Messier? Heather was already dealing with the fallout from Karen's twisted actions, and now it seemed there was an even darker force lurking behind the scenes. Who were these people Karen had been connected to? What had she gotten herself into? "Wait," Heather interrupted, her voice shaky. "Are you saying Karen isn't just some crazy neighbor? This is something bigger?" David gave a single nod. "This is much bigger than petty neighborhood disputes. Karen's been working with a network, and she's been using her position to manipulate things. The HOA, the city council, she's tied into a lot of power players, and they've all been protecting her. That's why no one ever stood up to her before. She wasn't just some troublemaker. She was a dangerous pawn in a much larger game." Heather's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Karen was a force to be reckoned with. But this was a revelation that turned everything she thought she knew upside down. David's eyes softened, as if sensing the whirlwind of thoughts that were crashing through Heather's mind. "I've been tracking her movements for months. She's been behind a lot of these smaller, accidental incidents. The vandalism, the threats, they weren't just random. She's been systematically trying to get you to leave, and now that you've stood up to her, she's pulling in everything she's got to destroy you." Heather's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place now. Everything made sense. The sabotage, the underhanded tactics, the way Karen had manipulated people into siding with her. But what was the endgame? What did Karen, or whoever was behind her, want? David's gaze grew serious. "You're in danger, Heather, but there's a way out, if you want it." The offer hung in the air between them like a heavy question mark. What did he mean by that? What kind of help could he possibly offer? But before she could ask more, Officer Green's voice cut through the moment, her tone urgent. "Heather, we need to go. We've got enough evidence now to charge Karen with assault, animal cruelty, and more, but we need to wrap this up. You're going to have to testify, and we need your cooperation." Heather hesitated for only a moment. She had come this far. She wasn't going to back down now. Karen had tried to destroy her life, and Heather was going to make sure the woman paid for every single thing she had done. David's eyes flickered with a knowing look, as if he understood exactly what was going through her mind. "I'll be here if you need me," he said simply, and just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Cliffhanger. Heather watched him go, the mystery of his involvement still gnawing at her. Who was he really? What game was he playing? And what did his words mean for the dangerous road ahead? The battle for her future wasn't over yet, and as Heather followed Officer Green to the squad car, her thoughts were clouded with questions about Karen, about the hidden network of power players, and about David's mysterious role in everything. The answers were just out of reach, but Heather knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going down without a fight.